Bien, bonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Abbey Dam in Normandy. Thank you for being again so numerous here for the 6th edition of the World Forum Normandy for Peace. Next to me, she has been with us since the beginning of this fantastic adventure. She is the founder of the Projet Imenge NGO. She is officially recognized by the UN. Frédéric Bedos.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to meet you, all of you again. Thank you for being here. Do I need to introduce the person who's been here? He's one of the inventors of this Forum Normandy for Peace. He's the vice president of the Normandy region in charge of international relationships and also the advocacy for the region, François-Xavier Briolo. So this month of September 2023, it's really the month of the big international meetings. I'm going to quote the General Assembly of the UN, the G20, and of course the International Day for Peace. And also the World Month of the Forum for Peace, Normandy Forum for Peace, and each year shows us, sadly, the necessity to meet again here in Normandy to discuss, to reflect together, to decrypt the major challenges on the state of the world and its trajectories. And as you know, in the DNA of our forum, there is youth. You are thousands of students to be present, and and you can really give yourself a hand. Congratulations. So, we are together for 2 days with a very intense program with this year. Not 2, but 3 major plenaries. There will be about 15 more thematic workshops and geographical workshops, youth sessions for students, the Village for Peace, with the library, with exhibitions. In summary, you'll be able to meet all the initiatives that have been taken in the permanent program Normandy pour la Paix during these 2 days. Just refer to the program that you have received when you came in here. I would like to express my thanks to everyone who has answered the invitation. About 150 people from all over the world. We are really a worldwide forum, an international forum. I know that is important for a scientific management team, Bertrand and Nicole. And if you're so numerous here at the Abbey, you're also numerous online on the social networks, on the website normandypourlapaix.fr, on YouTube and on Facebook. The hashtag is NPP 2023. Please report, comment, report. It would be great. It would be nice if peace would be making the buzz. So to really let's see again the main highlights of last year's edition. Flashback.
Le mur coupe ce qui permet aux humains de se comprendre entre eux.
Qu'aucun mur n'est infranchissable. Aucun mur, même celui qu'on a vu, éternel.
C'est la démocratie qui est le plus grand protecteur de la paix. Parce qu'en vérité, quand on a de la démocratie, c'est le peuple qui, au bout du compte, décide de son avenir.
J'ai assisté au concert aussi qui était très chouette. J'ai eu le temps de voir toutes les expos un peu sur le site entre midi et 2. Et là, je ressors de la conférence sur la Russie et l'Ukraine qui était très intéressante.
On est venu ici aussi pour le côté familial. C'est vrai qu'il y a des conférences pour les adultes, mais on aime bien cette approche également pour les enfants. Et ce qu'on apprécie aussi, c'est que ce soit accessible à tout le monde.
Sur le thème de la paix, c'est vrai que c'était intéressant et puis ça laisse libre cours à l'imagination des enfants.
So, ladies and gentlemen, this Forum Normandy for Peace, it's an initiative of the region Normandy, and you needed to be brave 7 years ago to start this beautiful adventure. Someone who said yes to this challenge. Please welcome the president of the Normandy region, Hervé Mour.
Bien, Monsieur Priolo.
Mr. Priolo, he's already applying censorship. He said my speech was going to be too long, so I'm going to skip over the formal salutation, say welcome to everyone, hello to everyone, and to say how happy and how moved I am to see you all here again for this edition. I wanted to say that since 2017, each edition confirms that this has become a recognized event and a singular event on the issues of peace and security around the world. I'm very proud when speakers at our event say that this is more intense, more dynamic, more free than the Paris Forum that was created some months after ours. Kind of a quick sidekick to the government. A huge thank you to the organizers, and particularly François-Xavier Priolo, Vice President of the Regions and Mayor of Louviers, who is always there for the promoting of this event and whose imagination and its capacity to promote this event and this forum is exceptional. And as you know, Normandy pour la Paix, it's not just these 2 days, it's also events, seminars, debates all around the year. There is a university research center, a pedagogical research center, and a indicator, the Normandy for Peace, that will be presented to you. And of course, her partner, Frédéric Bedos, who's been animating this with the wit that she is known for. Thank you also the members of the scientific committee, and particularly Nicole Niesotto and Bertrand Badi, these two major university figures that have allowed us to build something that is really smart and meaningful. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Bertrand, for the work that you devote to the Forum Normandy pour la Paix. Please give them a big hand. I also would like to thank the 65 agents of the regions that have volunteered to ensure the good functioning of this event, these 2 days, as well as our 10 partners that will be animating the Village for Peace and also thank you to the European Department, the International Action of the region, or the team of Julie Miclot that every year make miracles. I can say you can be proud of yourself, of your work. And finally, I'm really happy to have an open forum, contrary to the ones when I was a defense minister, like the one in Munich or Singapore, where the debates are very often held in a very sedated atmosphere with a very stiff formal diplomatic, where the stiff diplomatic language is extremely constrained. Our forum is, as we see the world, open, interactive, participative, with a massive presence of passionate youth of Normandy and for France. This is for me and for the father, which I am, that is the biggest reassurance to see how motivated you are to fight for human rights, for freedom and for peace. We said you're a generation that are consumer, that are blasé, you're more connected to networks rather than to each other. And I can see that every year the Forum Normandy for Peace, there is a live, dynamic youth that wants to fight for a better world and for ideals in which we all believe in. Thank you for your presence altogether, that you are so numerous here today. Thank you to all the numerous media. Sorry, I was asked to thank everyone, so I'm kind of long. Thank you to all the media that have accepted to be present here to cover this event. And thank you also to the 150 participants who come from 150 countries and 5 continents, 113 to the participants. Bertrand, you're going to do the first roundtable. I want to ask 2 questions on this radiography of resistances. I just want to I had far more questions, but I'm going to limit myself to these 2. Why, as Nicole said earlier, why is democracy receding in the world? And so the risks of war is getting worse, because let's remember it is a historical democracy is the best guarantee for the peace among peoples. Why the different indexes realized by different institutions, the established indexes demonstrate at least a stagnation of democratic regimes around the world, or regression, with a growing part of humanity being more educated and more developed. That is the contradiction. Why, when 2 or 3 billion people came out of misery thanks to globalization, it's not just economic, it's a trade exchange, it's also human exchange where we discover the others. Why this extraordinary development of humanity has not generated more democracy? Why, contrary to all the schemes that we have learned when we were at school, why the free market economy has not generated democracy and freedom around the world? I'm thinking about China, for instance, where we've always been told that opening up to the market economy, it would be one day a democratic country. But we could say this about many other countries in Asia and Africa. Why, even worse, ladies and gentlemen, where the democracies have been installed for decades, even for centuries, the populistic and nationalistic policies are progressing. The U.S. Capitol is invaded by the fanatic partisans of Trump. Who could have imagined that in the biggest democracy in the world? The populisms are progressing in our own countries with people that are educated, that went to school, and at the same time we have European states that have integrated enthusiastically the European space a couple of decades and now are negating on a certain number of fundamental principles. Why do we have about 20 democracies, even imperfect democracies, are receded and now are become authoritarian state, as all indexes in the past 20 years have shown? Maybe our representative democracies are imperfect and they need to be more participative democracy. Let's recognize we have lots of problems finding the proper balance apart the fantastic democracy, which is Switzerland. Maybe the migrant impact can explain in the older democracies why people are receding. The social networks, fake news, the quickening pace of technological mutation that generating fear and a drawback, and maybe the Tocquevillian movement where people exchange freedom against equality. All this can contribute, but if we call upon the conscience of our only democratic regimes that are built on the basis of freedom, are able to maintain peace and are able to control the madness of men. Very often someone who takes power and becomes paranoid, that we find in many countries. Democracy, liberal democracy, historically is not a wartime democracy. The first instance for the peoples is to improve democracy. That should not lead to disempowerment. And it's always a difficult balance. If you take the example of France, you can see how much we have to improve in terms of improvement of our own democracy. But I know at least one thing is that all world imbalances come from authoritarian regimes. Take China, where all diplomats say that the Chinese culture and the needs for growth would cause them less warmongering. Today, they are switching towards an arms race, international primacy, either crushing liberties in Hong Kong or even major war risk with Taiwan. We can also speak about Russia, of course. We can also mention, we can say that Putin can use that they feel surrounded or that NATO has made mistakes, but the invasion of the neighboring state by Russian army, this is a pathology of an authoritarian regime that is looking to save itself by leading campaigns abroad. I heard some former heads of state told me that Putin would never invade Ukraine, and the United States were wrong in the end. Putin not only invaded Ukraine, but he's also invaded Russia a long time ago. But worse, even worse, now he is threatening the rest of the world, because just like every autocrat, when he feels threatened, he can even think about the unimaginable by trying to keep his power. I'm thinking about the use of the nuclear weapons, which actually raises, and I think you will have a debate tomorrow about that, the issue of the nuclear arms proliferation, because at least we can make one statement together, is that the nuclear dissuasion has, of course, protected us from war, but it has not prevented war in Europe. And we can also tell ourselves that with the growing need for energy resources and the development of civil nuclear energy, we need to go more towards proliferation, but it's always the path that is taken in terms of proliferation. If you lead the latest declaration of the Prince of Saudi Arabia, asking not only wants civil nuclear energy, but also wants to have the technologies allowing them to develop uranium concentration, and indicating first that if Iran acquires the nuclear weapon, that would be a casus belli, and that would lead them directly towards starting their own nuclear weapons program. I continue to think that the abolition of the nuclear weapons is a message that the Europeans could carry, and I continue to think that without being naive, we could tell the entire world the major risk that we run by wanting to continue considering that the nuclear weapon could only be reserved to some responsible states. In the end, one day or the other, the nuclear weapon will end up between hands of men or irresponsible autocrats. That is just a question, dear Nicole, which we need to raise. I also wanted to finish with one topic that is a second resistance that was, for me, the beautiful news. It's the European resistance. It surprises me because the European will has been so weak in the past 50 years on the international stage, leaving the Russians and the United States the stage, the international stage, and even issues that concern our Europe directly. Europe is not a world power, sadly. We are just one big supermarket. But we have been able to stand up to the challenge when the Russian invasion happened in Ukraine. Not everything was perfect. There were some abandonments, there were some hesitations, but the European bloc stood up as one and answered the extraordinary courage of the Ukrainian people to save their independence. We have shown ourselves to be firm, but since we are Democrats, we've also been responsible in order to avoid the situation of the word, and the one who has been often presented as being a feeble old-timer, the US president, has been an extremely wise management of this crisis by showing a firm position and support to Ukraine, telling the Russians a certain number of things without creating the conditions for a general escalation. Not only you have to note this, we Europeans who have been able to renounce natural gas, which costs us in every day, not only have we helped the Ukrainians to defend themselves, but we've also learned the lessons from the reinforcement of our own security, which was, for the moment, was not exactly the priority of the European debate. Most of the European countries were basically hiding behind the NATO that would avoid them any debate in their own countries. The Germans announced 100 billion investment in their own defense. That it's not being yet implemented, but it's more announcement. And we, the French, have decided to reinforce our military efforts for our security. I actually would take the opportunity to tell you that I've read lots of nonsense about this, and I would like to go against at least one, according that we would not be able to hold 3 days in a high-intensity fight, or would not be able to hold a front line with such a big long time like in Ukraine, more than 2 weeks. This is complete nonsense. This has been relayed on the social networks, and I would like to invite you to ask yourself 3 questions. It's completely idiot and nonsense because France is at the entry of Europe, so all the coalition of the alliance would mean that it have before reaching France, you need to go through half of Europe. And what military force could today come to in order invade the continent, the European continent? Because the only threat that we had was the Russian threat, where we had seen that its army was more a tiger paper. And we can ask ourselves, we have the Chinese, of course. They are very far away. The Indians, maybe, we don't really think of them as being a threat. So who are we talking about when we think that maybe France would be invaded by some major army, just like in the Cold War times? The second reason why this is complete nonsense is because this goes completely contrary to the idea what we have built in terms of security alliance, which is the dissuasion. And the third one is there are solidarity mechanism in terms of security, which are the European treaties and the NATO treaties. That means that all these treaties would have failed, these treaties that guarantee our security in an alliance model with a dissuasion that is independent. Yes, we need more, more stock in terms of ammunition, in terms of rockets, but no, there is no enemy at our doorstep that would force us to massively rebuild stocks of the tanks or like artillery, like in the times of the Cold War. Indeed, the essential of the effort that we need to realize, it is in the space in cybersecurity, in protection with biological threats, and certainly not in the building of new tanks and cannons. This beautiful surprise that was the European resistance needs to bring us to ask us on the one relationship, and I want to finish on that.
La relation avec le continent africain.
The relationship with the African continent. Try to tell to the Africans. We have been able to build an exceptional model. It is not a perfect indeed, but we are the only ones that have achieved an order that is based on the rights of the states that is imposed, and we could propose that this model inspire the new world order, where we see that it needs to be rebuilt. And so, in this will, we could propose, after the French debacle in Africa, we could propose to the African countries an alliance. This alliance would be an alliance of support to development and support to the emergence of democracy. I'm just giving you 2 figures.
Le PIB européen.
The gross GDP product of European is 17,000 billion euros. The GDP of Mali, of Burkina Faso, and Niger is less than 50 billion euro. I tell myself that we Europeans could have as a project to propose a true development project in Africa based on the idea to favor the emergence of food sovereignty, of development, and to favor the emergence of democracy by respecting the sovereignty of these states, and by denouncing, we need to tell him, the generalized corruption that exists in these countries and that is making its populations poorer. This is a plan we could propose, but you need to be aware that when the putsch officers in Niger saying we need to kick the French out to find ourselves. I know Niger, I've went there numerous times. In Niger, there is sadly nothing. There's no state, no administration, no army, no perspectives of development, and where the French will leave other colonizers will come over, and the new colonizers will probably have even less scruples than the European democracies in this domain. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, I defend this idea that one of the resistance we need to go towards is to make sure that the European people carry its project around the world in an alliance that is respectful of the state sovereignties. And that is why, and I would like to finish with this, dear François-Xavier, I would like to open up a new workshop in Normandy pour la paix. Within the university chair, we're going to launch a young leaders program. What does this mean? This will allow us to welcome each year in Normandy about 10 young, high potential youth from the emerging countries, for which we will try to provide them with, or at least to help them to build struggles in their countries around human rights, about good governance, and to ensure that these young people can be inspired by what can be done in best practices in public governments, in the respecting of rights, in respecting of liberties, and these young people can be ambassadors for the democracy for tomorrow. This is what we're going to do starting next year. 10 young people coming from emerging countries that will come to the University of Caen with a scholarship to work with us on the emerging, on these values in which we all believe. Ladies and gentlemen, have a good day. Long live Normandy, long live democracy, and long live liberty.
Merci. Merci.
Thank you very much. Normandy for Peace Forum 2023 is now officially open.
Résistance.
Resistance is the peace of people. That's the topic that the scientific committee decided to focus on this year. And now we're going to be hearing from Bertrand Badi. Bertrand Badi and Nicolas chosen the right topic, I think we can say. So with revolts, different forms of rebellion, and now on the rise all across the globe. Resistances are the guideline for the two key sessions in the plenary, this morning's session and tomorrow morning's session. This morning, we're going to get started by trying to understand what is happening with resistance. What does it mean to resist in 2023? And some key figures of resistances will be here to tell us about their struggles. And tomorrow, we'll be talking about something which should be obvious, but often is something that is ignored, that there's no sustainable peace without people, because peace agreements are often negotiated without the population being involved in the debates, without their concerns, without their suffering, their desires being taken into account. The result is that you have peace on paper, but any incidents immediately tear up this paper. So how can we understand and guide peace? That is what we're going to be talking about over the next 2 days. If you've been here in recent years, INAL has been one of the key partners of the forum since the beginning. And every year we have a web series that we can show you now. Here's the web series.
Résister, c'est faire le choix de s'opposer.
Resisting is to oppose, to ensure that your voice is heard.
La résistance est
Resistance is linked to our survival instinct. It's a moment where you decide to face up, to say no more. It may be done discreetly or more overtly. In the past and today, we are demanding our liberty, our independence, our freedom, and to try and build peace.
L'année 2022.
In 2022, there were many episodes of resistance across the planet. All across the globe, people defended themselves against external enemies to protect their rights, to show their disagreement with the policies of their leaders, or to alert people about the dangers across the globe. These events show people's desire to control their future.
Depuis la seconde moitié du XXe siècle,
since the second half of the 20th century, there has been many episodes of resistance. They have been more or less noisy, more or less heroic or discreet, but often violence breaks out. Sometimes it can just be one word or one action that changes the course of history.
J'avais deux options dans ma vie.
I had two options in my life.
Attendre d'être tué.
To keep quiet and wait to be killed, or secondly, to speak up
La deuxième option.
and then be potentially killed. I chose the second option.
Ou encore Martin Luther King ont été des résistants.
Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, they were all resistance, and they changed the lives of millions of people.
L'élaboration de la paix.
And they helped to build peace in their own way.
La plume ou le poing.
By taking arms or by taking your pen in hand, people are rising up against injustice and attracting our attention about serious situations.
Qu'elles échouent ou qu'elles réussissent.
Whether it's successful or not, these episodes of resistance ensure that we are more vigilant.
Et l'intégralité de cette web...
All of these web series about resistance can be seen here in the Village for Peace and also on the website, on the INA website, and also the Normandy for Peace website. The Radiography of Resistance, that's the title of this plenary session. So we're going to be hearing first from
son dernier livre,
the Professor Emeritus at Sciences Po Paris, and his most recent book is available in our library, and he'll be signing the book tomorrow at midday. He's been many years at this forum. Please give a round of applause to Bertrand Badier.
Rien, mesdames et messieurs.
Ladies and gentlemen, nothing is external to human beings. What other goal can you find in policy than human beings ourselves? This is the reason why we need to go beyond old ways of thinking. Old ways of thinking where we were told that everything is human except for international relations. I remember a minister who said one day, let public opinion understand international matters would be like admitting the family of the patient into the surgery room. Raymond Aron said that international relations were just something which soldiers and diplomats focus on, but this age is over. This age is over like the age of gladiators is over. They themselves represented the dynamic of war and peace.
Progressivement,
gradually,
an
energy has been born, a mysterious social energy which is invading, controlling, and organizing our international relations nowadays. Over the next 2 days, let's think about this mysterious social energy which is really guiding policy now. This social energy which we can only name metaphorically because it's so quite difficult to define it, understand it. And yet, it is an old story. It is an old story that in terms of ideas, it is here in Normandy, somebody from Lower Normandy, a few centuries ago. Abbé de Saint-Pierre, saying this for our student friends here, Abbé de Saint-Pierre explained that the balance of power, the balance of different forces was not really all that important in terms of peace itself. Abbé de Saint-Pierre was born in this region, and he explained that you can only build peace by taking into account social well-being. He was one of the key thinkers and key stakeholders as well because he was active he introduced the idea of well-being, social well-being, in the debate about war and peace. So this was a key piece of progress because Abbé de Saint-Pierre really gave a name, a definition to peace. Up till then, people considered peace was just a period when there was no war. But peace is much more than no war. Abbé de Saint-Pierre explained that peace is also satisfying social needs. It's also about building social balance. And thus the question was simple. Why is there war? Why is there war? Because social balances have not been respected. That is the first key factor, but there are other key factors. First of all, what I would call the slow social appropriation of war and peace.
Ah oui, mais en amphi, j'aime pas ça. Même quand on est président. Bon, enfin bref. Bah oui, vous savez, les vieux profs. Ça...
Well, I'm an old teacher. I like to ensure that everybody's listening. So what is social appropriation? Well, you see the first step with the French Revolution. War until before the French Revolution was fundamentally all about armies. And societies were only indirectly affected, but not as stakeholders themselves. But with the French Revolution, with citizens as soldiers, so society became stakeholders in war. And this was a first form of social appropriation, but it was quickly shackled by patriotism and nationalism. Then there was a second step, the arrival of public opinion onto the international stage. You may know that the first arrival of public opinion on the international stage in topics of war and peace was in the war in Crimea. For the first time, the press really started to talk about it. There was really the birth of a national and international public opinion.
Lord Cardigan, pour en faire le fameux cardigan, et ainsi.
They've discovered Lord Cardigan.
Et enfin, la troisième étape, c'est l'entrée.
And then the third step was the arrival of social entrepreneurs in war, NGOs who are doing great work now, not just in terms of humanitarian aid, but also in terms of diplomatic affairs. And thus, little by little, we see the change, the huge change that we are part of now, with stakeholders, more social stakeholders coming onto the international stage. And social stakeholders move more quicker than political stakeholders. So social stakeholders create events, whereas politicians just react, trying to run behind and catch up with this social buzz. So what is the factors behind, what are the explanations behind this social buzz? Well, there is the role of people, of populations on the international stage. And why are they more and more active? Well, because peoples are more and more served by communication. War is more visible, and the more visible war is, the more it becomes something which is being shared by everyone. So this first revolution, the revolution of communication, gives a key active role to society itself. But there's also the interests of acting yourself, because war is more often explained by social and economic factors. So social stakeholders are thus forced to take action. And a third aspect, maybe the most important aspect, is this gap between political orders and social orders. I don't believe between opposing democracy and authoritarianism. It's more complicated than that. But the first thing we should take into account is the gap between the social and the political. When you create such a huge abyss between the social and the political, when social stakeholders in both democratic or authoritarian situations, when they no longer believe in their institutions and there is unrest in terms of how we identify with the institutions and with politics, then this crisis, this tension between the social and the political,
cette énergie sociale que je nommais tout à l'heure,
gives strength to this social energy, and that explains its current role, I would say. Thus, what is social resistance? Well, it's the resistance of the forgotten people, those who left at the roadside of the international system. I will talk a bit about the Palestinian people later on. It is also the dominated peoples, the importance of decolonialized movements, and it's also those who have been humiliated, migrant persons, refugees, and all those who are not recognized. And because they are not recognized, they create, via the humiliation that they have been afflicted with, they express their anger, and their social anger has been behind this social energy. There's also different cultures. As globalization has been built, the world when it was starting to be built, the world was plurally culturally, and the 8 million human beings do not recognize just one model. They say, this is not our world, this is not our model, this is not our history, this is not our experience, this globalized world. And we resist against this paternalist system that wants us all to abide by one truth that we will have no control over.
Que dire enfin du facteur?
And what about the economic factor? That's something we should not forget. Social resistance on the international stage shows the failure of neoliberalism.
Démocratie, mais le néolibéralisme.
Capitalism was meant to lead to democracy, but neoliberalism, leading to privatization, putting an end to subsidies, it has created
qui commence au Caire en 19...
this situation, this rosary
1982
of hunger strikes that started in Cairo in 1977, 1981 in Casablanca, 1982 in Caracas, 1989 in Caracas, sorry, and I could say more.
N'oublions pas que la
And it's explode in the Middle East. Do not forget that the Sudanese revolution started in Al-Bara due to a rise of the price of bread. So, ladies and gentlemen, this social resistance has a composite story. There are many factors behind it, but fundamentally, it's an echo of 3 major breakthroughs that we have experienced in recent years. Decolonialization. Decolonialization is the major victory of the people. It's the first major social resistance against political domination. Depolarization, secondly. The end of the fight between two powers. We've seen more margin given to social aspects on the international stage. And third aspect, globalization. Globalization is this generalized communication that I was talking about, social tragedies that are gaining invisibility, social imaginaries that are building, coming stronger and stronger on a daily basis. So when a social imaginary is growing stronger and becoming more globalized, it will no longer leave the international stage. And above all, there's been the birth of key global matters. When you say globalization, you say one world, which says global security before national security. And global security is not what
La police a reçu le nom de sécurité globale.
was called global security when we're talking about the police. Global security is about security for all of humanity. Climate security, hygienic security, economic security, individual security, cultural security, institutional security.
étudiants nommés les 7.
Dear students, there are 7 types of human security that the UNDP identified in its report in 1994.
Et c'est de cela dont nous...
And this is what we're going to be talking about over these next 2 days. This is what allows us to believe in humanity and to show that all political quarrels are just old man's quarrels nowadays. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much, Bertrand.
Vous pouvez vous installer à la table parce que vous
Would you like to take your seat because you'll be here for the next roundtable session. So the first roundtable session is called the refuse of empower, being powerless, and springs of resistance. So could we please welcome to the stage Niagale Bakayoko, President of the African Security Sector Network, the socialist Michael Vivorka, and Delphine Alès, Professor of Political Science and Vice President of INELCO. Welcome to the stage.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everybody.
Pour la paix.
Welcome to the Forum for Peace.
Très à l'écoute ce matin.
So you've got very interested listeners here in front of you. So let's get started with you, Michel Vivorka. You're a sociologist and you worked a lot on all of these different topics. So the question we're looking at is, what are the springs of resistance? Are they all the same as previous springs of resistance? So, in other words, in 2023, what can trigger resistance movements? We should not be naive. There are different types of springs, of triggers. So maybe we need to think about the different levels. There are triggers, springs, where you have a given situation where you're invaded, where there's a dictatorship, where bosses are being brutal, and you react. And then there's a second level, second type, which is the profound sense of resistance. Thinking about values that lead people to mobilize, and these can vary greatly. Let me give you an example. When there were dissidents in the USSR, there were some people that were very nationalistic, some who were maybe anti-Semitic. There were great Democrats, Zakharov, and so there were many different types of people. And yet all of these individuals embodied a resistance. And the second thing I would like to say is that some resistance movements bring together, yes, different types of people who have different values that drive them. I believe in the Ukrainian resistance, but when you talk about the Azov regiment,
un mouvement de résistance se transforme.
That has a link with the Nazi ideology. They're working hand in hand, but maybe they'll separate further down the line. Ukraine has been great from this point of view. The national identity is at the heart of their resistance. But the national identity was not so strong in the past. The democracy is now at the heart of their resistance. The rule of law was not so strong in the past. So the paradox is that resistance improves the capacity for resistance over time, but we have to be careful.
J'ai beaucoup étudié, peut-être que
the opposite can happen.
Solidarność en Pologne.
I studied a lot about the Solidarność movement in Poland. I loved it. I spent 18 months of my life in Poland, and it was a great movement.
Porté entre autres choses.
But it was led by a very positive idea of the nation, very open idea. Maybe for the younger people here, could you tell us a little bit about Solidarność? Thank you. I'd like to tell you more about it.
Un mouvement apparaît en Pologne d'un seul coup.
In 1980, a movement appeared in Poland, in a country which, up till then, had been under a communist and very authoritarian regime. And this movement was a workers' movement, a social movement, the type of thing that you were talking about, Bertrand. So they were workers in the shipyard at the beginning that started this movement. You may have seen images on the TV Veleza, who was there in the shipyard being carried, and there was a national movement saying that we're fed up of being dominated by a foreign power, the Soviet Union. And third of all, it was a democratic movement. So there were intellectuals, academics come from Warsaw, joining the workers who felt that they were supported by the Pope. And this led to a great emancipation movement, a non-violent movement, an international and national movement. So they were looking at the country itself and the world from outside. So social leads to the international, Bertrand. They said, we want things, we're going to do it. But then there's this social ogre, the Soviet Union, which could invade us. Jaruzelski broke this movement. But the general was not completely against the resistance himself, because he was Polish, so he believed in the national cause. So yes, he was on the Soviet side, but maybe he contributed to ensure that there was no tanks arriving to break up the movement. That was something in the past, but nowadays we could say that the situation in Poland has changed greatly, that the good ideas from 1980 and 1981 now seem far away. And the good nationalism that was carrying Solidarność in 1980-1981 has now led to a very authoritarian government, a very far-right government. So that was very interesting, Michel, what you were just saying, because in these types of resistant movements that come spontaneously from the grassroots, there are often an imbalance of power. So must we impose limits on resistance movements? We can all think of resistant movements which have become violent, terrorism acts, maybe hostages are taken in these types of movements. So does the use of violence make resistance movements illegitimate? Does the end justify the means? Well, we've seen images of non-violent stakeholders, but we should be careful because sometimes violence opens the path to resistance. Let me give you an example. In the mid-70s, there was the end of the Franco regime, and there was the Basque terrorist regime movement that was born, ETA, and the only person in the regime that wanted to continue Franco's work was Amilcar Blanco, and he embodied authoritarianism. And the people from ETA wanted to kidnap this admiral for technical reasons and then decided to kill him. They blew up his car. He was quite a creature of habit, so he always took the same journey every day. So they put explosives under his car and blew it up. They killed this man. And this contributed to accelerating the transition of Spain towards democracy. So violence did do something positive that day, but then 10 years later, the same ETA was putting bombs in supermarkets, killing civilians, and violence became a catastrophe for this movement at this point. So we shouldn't necessarily say that all violence is negative, but violence produces logics which quickly escalate and lead to things we should absolutely avoid. So let me just add something to what Bertrand was saying. I think there's a fourth step in the process you were talking about, that social sciences starting to build the end of violence, prevention of violence. They're starting to see this as an area of expertise and an area for research. And increasingly we realize that we need to study violence, and that prevention of violence, the end of violence, is something that we really should focus on and research.
Alors la violence, souvent le
So violence African continent is often a theater of violence. I'm going to now turn to Nyagale Bagayoko. We've seen since 2020 a certain number of coups in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, in Sudan, this summer in Niger and Gabon. There's kind of something where we're losing oversight because we see all these coups and we can see popular support for these coups. And so that kind of changes the vision that we have. We usually think that a coup is against the people. And here we see marches, support, popular support. What is actually the reality of the support for these coups? Yes, indeed. You need to remind that there's been 7 coups since the summer 2020 in Central Africa, in the Sahel region, and also in West Africa. And there are 2 types of coups. The first one, I would describe it through the big examples of Chad and Sudan, where the power grab by the army has been done against the people's will and actually led to repressions, to bloody repressions. And on the other hand, in the 5 other states, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, in Niger, and in Gabon, the army grabbed the power, and we realized that there was popular support, massive popular support, that accompanied the power grab by the military. And today, actually are their best way to remain in power, this popular support. At least if we take the case of Mali and Burkina Faso, and in certain degree Guinea, but also Niger and Burkina Faso, it's too early to tell. But what it reveals is that there is a huge revolutionary wave. We've underlined the fact that Africa had not known a spring as we had seen in the Arab countries. There was no African spring instead of an Arab, like an Arab spring. But Africa is really at the head of the spearhead of the democratic revolutions in 90 years after the national conferences. But today, the revolution takes a nationalistic aspect because these military juntas, they meet the needs of the people. They want to affirm themselves. They want to emancipate themselves. They want to build a national pride against the outside forces. And it's all the authoritarian practices that are often implemented by these military forces, particularly in terms of restrictions of fundamental rights and freedoms and the state of law. They're not condemned by the population because they consider that democracy has not met their needs, has been reduced to its still electoralist version, that has not allowed any inclusivity, has not allowed to get back to what Professor Badi was saying. It has not allowed to realize individual and collective progresses in terms of social and economic development, in terms of education, in terms of decentralization, in terms of urbanization, in terms of security also. Because in all the crises that we have seen in the Sahel region, of course, but we could also speak a crisis in Democratic Republic of Congo. It was always the civil populations that have been the first suffering, the first victims. So it's all these failures of a liberal democratic order that was incarnated by civil elites that have very often that have been devoid of these liberties to remain in power, and very often through the multilateral organization in Africa, which explains why they're losing legitimacy, but also the international partners. That's why there is this rejection and the resistance to the international liberal or democratic order which we're seeing in Africa today. So Bertrand Badi, you wanted to answer to that? No, not react. But I would like to support what my colleague was saying. I would like to what Michel Miboka was saying early on. I would like to remind that in the very strange history of war, war was always presented as an exceptional war by definition, completely legitimate. We are now seeing in a deregulation of the market of violence, to be kind of speaking it in a caricatural means, war is not this exceptional form of violence, and this violence is now merging into all types of other forms. So the question of legitimacy is not more or less the resistance in France was violent. The resistance against colonization was violent. Luckily, else it would never have succeeded, and we could continue the examples. And to support what Niagale was saying, I would like to say that you need to be careful. Social resistance does not necessarily follow the narrow path of democracy, and for three reasons. One is when there is no democracy, you cannot use democratic tools in order to achieve democracy. In China in 1989 or in 2022, in Iran in September 2022, and we could give you many other examples. The second reason, and we don't say it enough, and I look towards my friends, students, and it is very important to be in the democracy, to share the meaning of democracy. If democracy does not have a meaning in the way it presents itself to the audience, is not understood, is not heard, it's foreign, it's kind of seen as a kind of imported paternalistic practice, then it's not going to work. And there's other values, which are the nationalistic values and the emancipation values, that are going to take precedence. And as Niagale has said, there's a third element of differentiation between the social resistance and democracy. It's the efficacy. What is democracy worth when it doesn't contribute anything, when it doesn't provide you anything? That is a question that's as old as democracy itself. Thank you. Now, Delfinales, could you maybe describe the evolution of resistance movements and the movements against established order? We've known the non-aligned, the unaligned movement that was aligned by ideal of transformation of the international order. We thought that it could be possible to imagine a third way. Is this idea completely now fallen out of fashion? No, it's not. It's absolutely not. It's still valid. Before we go back to this, I would like to react to what my speakers before me have said, because I think it's useful, particularly for the younger audiences, to get back to what is a common point of the resistance movements and to allow us to see it in historical level. All the movements that we mentioned earlier in the previous speeches, be it decolonization, I'll get back on the Bandung conference, for instance, be it Solidarność in Poland, or the supports to the popular support for the coups in Africa. All these have a common aspect, that there are expressions of a resistance against a means of control on the future of populations. You find this in decolonization. You find this in all the struggles against the established order. This is a common point in all the resistance movements. And the second element is all these movements have in common is that the expression of a dissatisfaction between what has been promised in terms of political evolution, social evolution, the promises of globalization, and what has really happened, what Niagale mentioned in terms of the African continent. This is something that we find in this historical view and allows us to link with the situation, with the movements that were expressing a form of finding a third way in the 1950s. The 60s are this idea of being non-aligned, and what seems to be today far more diffuse, less universalistic resistances as what being expressed back then. We were in the 1950s and 1960s. We're talking about the non-aligned, about this emerging idea in the 1950s in the Conference of Bandung that's organized in Indonesia. There was the first truly international event bringing together peoples that were freshly decolonized or just about to be decolonized from the Asian and African continent. And what is interesting to note is that when we look at the debates that were held in Bandung and the conclusions of this conference, that is absolutely not a protesting discourse. That it was absolutely not going against the established order. It's extremely universal. It is extremely constructive regarding the international order that is being created, particularly at the national state. The 10 principles of the Bandung Conference, it's not much more than what basically the UN Charter, but it's pleading for the implementation of this UN Charter in a context where the recently decolonized peoples say that, yes, they have been invited to the international table, but with a secondary position, but that countervenes the central principles of the international order, which is the sovereignty and the equality between the people. So what is being expressed back then in 1955, and that's being formalized in 1961, with the creation of the non-aligned movement, is an aspiration for more equality, but nothing more than what the national or international order promised them progressively. This claim, this constructive and universal claim, transformed in a certain bitterness and a protest against the international or the unfairness of the international order, to all the claims that are far more nationalistic, because they're saying that in the end, the universalism has not kept its promises. And yeah, we don't believe in it anymore. We think that this international order is structurally unequal, and before we thought that we could eventually build this universalism, we necessarily think that the actually institutionalized international order is structurally unequal, but there's nevertheless some expression of universalism that express themselves, that do it far more discreet, like resistance movements, more discrete resistance movements. And I find, for instance, very interesting to observe what is happening at the local stage, very often far from what the international media are reporting or the international politics. Many NGOs are being set up, particularly in the countries of the Global South, with ambitions that are not those that were privileged all the way up until the 1990s, which was necessarily going through the international stage as a stage of expression of legitimization. We see today that the young militants, they organize themselves and they set up discrete and constructive resistance movements, and they do it with ambitions to improve their living conditions at a ultra-local level sometimes, without necessarily going through a global political message where people think that it's actually useless or counterproductive. So basically, we say we cannot change the international order, it's too far away from us. We are going to act where we have leverages, so at local level, in a certain way. And I turn again to Nyegale Bayagoko. You said the populations there have been very disappointed with this fake democracy after this big hopes of the 1990s. They don't believe in it anymore. So say, after all, why not try more authoritarian regimes coming from a coup? We're going to see what happens, and if that is better. And the paradox, we can see that these leaders from different African countries, they also count on other major actors of the stage like China or Russia. We say, okay, let's do new alliances with them to maybe have a bigger role at the international table. Is that... I am under the impression that today the world, and particularly the Western world, is realizing that the African continent has created, the last 20 years, numerous alternative partnerships. It's nothing new. It's not since the arrival of the Wagner Group in 2017 in Central African Republic, and then even more underlined by media and the international decision-making forces in Mali, that the African states or their own companies or their civil societies actually have internationalized themselves. We are, since a certain number of years, since the last 2 decades actually, in an approach and in a more theoretical approach, we can qualify as being a realistic maximization of their opportunities, while we always present the African states as being victims that have necessary need to access to international aid, that they would become as big as the development of jihadi movement on the African continent. That is the origin of the relationships that were developed with the Gulf states of the Persian Gulf. That is very important to recall that. The importance of Turkey today, it does not date from yesterday. It's nothing new. The links that were established with India always was very present in the southern part of the African continent. This is nothing new. And I think that we need to look at these issues from this point of view rather than seeing dark maneuvers from authoritarian regimes. Absolutely share the opinions of Professor Badil, as often, since he is one of my teachers, regarding the very artificial opposition between democracy and authoritarianism. We are not in the scheme today. What we see today is far more the coming together of more and more authoritarian aspiration with this strongman figure, which is very popular in the opinion, and the African leaders, of course, Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, is seen as a strongman. But the role of Paul Kagame, for instance, in Rwanda, who is extremely admired on the continent, with an inspiration for the political forces, and that needs to raise questions. And I would finish on that. We're always on the impression that it's the Africans that are being manipulated by foreign forces. And it's quite interesting to see that the people are basically passing the hot potato on, saying France or Europe is saying, it's Russia that is inciting all these coups. And on the other side, the other camp, the other side is going to say, yeah, it's France, France Afrique, it's the French colonialism, and the Africans are manipulated by the French. No, you need to accept and really claim the idea that Africans are not puppets. They are not puppets in the hands of foreign forces. And the attractivity, the true soft power that we are seeing for the countries you have mentioned, Russia, China, etc., is really linked to a convergence of social aspirations. The claims of European in terms of women's rights, in terms of LGBT, the minorities, that is really seen as something that is really offensive on the African continent. And this moral outlook, this very conservative approach made by a certain number of states, is actually a factor of attractivity for the society, who are also very conservative. Michel Vivorca, you wanted to add something like this? Yes. The more I hear Niagale, the more I become pessimistic, because at the beginning she was saying, okay, I want to simplify this. There is a good society that is basically getting rid of colonizers, but in the end, I'm not going to all for the landscape, but okay, where is all this going to lead us? And I don't want to make any excessive comparison. I'm thinking about the Nazi or fascist experiences that were not just come out of terror, out of Hitler, who was manipulating the masses, and etc. It's also a popular adhesion. I've seen a movie, a documentary, where Mussolini is in front of 20,000 people in Trieste, and there is a huge popular support. And so these regimes can also lead to that. So I think you really need to be worried about that. Not only it can lead to this, but we haven't mentioned it yet, but the media mention it all the time. All this can lead to situations of crisis, of growing incapacity of the military power to act, and so the proliferation of jihadism and radical Islam and terrorism and regional complications with Algeria, etc., etc. I don't want to go into all that. Just to say, you need to listen to what is positive in these mobilizations, in these movements. I am not saying they're positive, I just analyze them, says Ms. Bagayoko. But there can be forms of affirmation of nationalism, but it can also lead to go astray and lead to more dramatic and worrying changes. Can I quickly answer that? Yes, it's extremely important to note to what has been described by President Hervé Morin, this reactionary wave that is really concerning the entire world, Africa too. There is a change today in civil societies that have supported in the 1980s democracy and human rights, and now they're becoming majority nationalistic, pan-Africanist, and for some they affirm a black suprematism. So yes, there is something to be worried about of the actual evolution. In this forum, we're not here to be naive. We're here to face the issues. And what I like is that we realize how complex it is, how nuanced our point of view needs to be, which is something that is lacking today. I would like to get back on the fact that there's more tensions, and it leads to the proliferation of radical Islam. It maybe would be interesting to have a look at the religious aspect. So I turn to you, Delphine Alès. We mentioned together with you this universalist ideal that more and more fell back, and this has felt as a powerlessness. And now people said, okay, let's focus on my territory, on my community, where I know where I have my identity. And at the heart of the identity, there's often the religious belonging. So you worked a lot on the religious. You actually speak not of a confessionalization of society. And so according to you, the religious factor, is it an integration factor or a seed of resistance? I'm going to try to nuance this. I don't think that the religious factor is autonomous. It's never disconnected from the social. The religious factor is never in itself an integration, seed of integration or resistance. It depends what the actors do. Let's give an example. Christianity, between the conservative position and to the support to conservative actors like Opus Dei or the theology of liberation in Latin America. We have complete two usages of the religious factor, or the use of Islam as a support to a conservative government in Saudi Arabia, and its mobilization as a revolutionary movement in Iran in '79, or this mobilization by a religious organization that support the state and democracy on the state in Indonesia. So there's three uses of religious. There is no autonomy per se of the religious factor, or a political mobilization of the religious factor. That is a very important point. The second point that I find very interesting is that behind this idea of confessionalization is not the fact, as we hear it sometimes in a very simplified and simplest way, that there is a return of the religious factor in the political and social. The religious factor never left the stage. It's been partially pushed back or pushed into on the sidelines on the private sphere in the Western world, but at the international level, it never left the political world. But our way of looking at it, if I look at the social scientists, the predominant actors on the international stage, has changed on this factor, and there's now a confessionalization of our analysis of the religious factor, and there's as a social factor, and there's a confessionalization of the political management of the social movement. So we have a tendency, the last 20 years, to consider that resistant movements, protest movements are led by a religious factor, even though this factor is never alone. It's always born from a form of dissatisfaction vis-à-vis a concrete situation. So this confessionalization leads to, for instance, to a multiplication of mediation, conflict mediation, through interreligious forums, either at local or international level, very often with a somewhat artificial dimension, insofar as, again, it leads to not dealing with the actual root factors of the conflict. A religious actor, very often they're social actors like any others. You need to integrate them. Very often it has not been done in this dialogue mechanism. They are social actors, but reducing a conflict to just, we see the more conflicts are further, the more they're complex, the more they are being analyzed in confessional terms, and that leads to leaving aside a certain number of economical and social aspects. Okay, a certain number. Another last question, because the time is running out, and Bertrand Badi will probably speak last. Michel Vivorca, an action of resistance. We are thinking about conflicts that are lasting, which we can't regulate politically or sort out politically, where we have an impression of being in a dead end in terms of a capacity of finding solution. My question is, how far can the resistance go, and when do you need to stop the resistance? What are the conditions? And you worked a lot on Colombia, on the FARC, on the FARC guerrilla. At one moment there was an end to the resistance and there was an agreement. When can you end a resistance? What happened in Colombia a couple of years ago, there was one last big guerrilla movement in Latin America, which indeed was less and less political and ideological and much more a crime-based organization in the drug dealing. So they were weakened. So it's a question of balance of power, just like what you're discussing with Russia and Ukraine. And today there will be a negotiation the day one of the two warring parties will be weakened. I think on both sides you need to have a desire to end things, to say, okay, for a reason or another, but there must be a desire to finish the war. It can go via a leader, and that desire can also be very cynical. I remember a former ETA militant who played an important role, and one day he said, we need to finish this, and he was the important negotiator of the end of the armed struggle of the Basque, but not by conviction that violence is not good. He was a political animal. He says, okay, violence is not paying off anymore. We need to be pragmatic and we need to find another solution. And the third thing is very important. You need people that help you get out. You need NGOs. You need countries like Norway or country like Switzerland. You need stakeholders that are mediators. You need people that organize Oslo. It didn't work, but if we don't have people who help you to ensure that the different stakeholders, an important after an episode of violence, they get back together and speak. I read testimonies of people who had discussed at the Oslo meetings. Of course, on the Israeli and the Palestinians were saying the same. We were certain to have barbarians, uneducated people. And after a while, we got along so well that I invited the son of the Palestinian counterpart to the wedding of my daughter. We need people to create a capacity of transforming the break off in a debate and in an institutionalized conflict without violence. So there we need people that help you. It can be churches, can be NGOs, can be states, it can be intellectuals. But it's very important, this role of mediation. It can be forums like this one. Thank you. Bertrand, one last word to close. Yes, many things were mentioned in this roundtable, and it's fantastic. But we were speaking about conservative society. It's important. Behind the notion of conservative, which of course is growing again, what is behind? There is a deep fear. Conservatism is always fed by fear, the fear of change, the fear of globalization. We, the people of our generations, we are seeing the most scaring break-off ever since we go from the national to the world stage, and that creates fear, and fear creates this kind of a general feeling on unease. And what we need to remember among all these things and these exchanges is this dialectic between the social discontent and the end and the social energy. This is really structuring on the international stage. And when I look at our friends who are from the schools here, to tell them, if you want to really understand the international relations today, it's not from the geopolitical standpoint. That is finished. It's useless. You really need to, at the new sociology, a sociology of the world, a sociology that really starts from this infinity of social parameters that we have implemented. And you're going to have lots of time to digest this. And behind the sociology of the world, we are going to rediscover the plain role of the human. The idea is not to judge, to say they are wrong, we are right. That's not the idea. Is not to know if the Nigerians who are demonstrating in the street, asking for the French to leave, it's a right or wrong. It's a social fact that it's been rooted in for decades in the story of this country, and we need to face it. Because if we don't deal with the people we have in front of, if we only speak about a private particular gods, then we'll escalate our errors. That is what the forum today wants to bring you, is the sociology of the world, of you are part and of you, the stakeholders. You're not outside of that. Thank you for this conclusion of this round table.
Ce sont des sujets
These are topics we could speak for years about it. Luckily, we also have excellent books, among them the book, Michel Vivoca, you have just published at Robert Laffont for a fighting democracy. You see the cover. You will be at the village library right after this plenary to sign the book. Thank you.
Ah oui. À toi.
C'est un sujet très difficile.
It's a very difficult topic, almost a taboo topic, but unavoidable, because it's probably the darkest aspect of any conflict, and on all the
des femmes.
In all the wars, it concerns mainly women, very often children, the most vulnerable among us. Sexual violence, we are not allowed to remain silent in face of them. A woman has received a mandate by the Secretary General on fighting on sexual violence in conflict. She travels around the world to denounce these crimes, to ensure that justice is given out. It's an honor for her. Please welcome Pramila Patten.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président Morin, Mesdames et
Good morning, Mr. President Morin, ladies and gentlemen, dear students. I'm delighted to speak to you this morning as part of this forum and in this lovely region which is full of history. And I believe that this event reminds us how precious peace is. The use of rape as a war tactic, as a torture tactic, as a terror tactic, as a tool for political repression, is something which is difficult to openly talk about. So I welcome the initiative of talking about sexual violence in conflicts, which is one of the main secrets of history and one of the main atrocities in our current world, at the heart of this session on resistances. In front of the Security Council last July, I presented some examples of cases of sexual violence that have been documented by my bureau last year. Amongst these examples was the case of a woman in the Tigrian region who was raped by 27 Ethiopian and Eritrean soldiers. In Ethiopia, many survivors have contracted HIV following a rape, and they're now dealing with a life of stigma. In Ukraine, there was a girl of age 4 who was raped by a Russian soldier in front of her parents, and a young girl who was aged 12 who was raped by several Russian soldiers and is now pregnant. In Central African Republic, there's a case of a woman who died following a rape by several members of an armed group who accused her of having a relationship with members of the National Armed Forces. Or also the cases of women in Haiti who were raped by members of gangs in front of their children after having seen their husbands executed. In Haiti, many women are raped in daylight. Ladies and gentlemen, the reality is that we are meeting at a moment where the trends in social conflicts, sexual violence in conflicts, are getting worse, and when the brutality in the battlefields in the 21st century continues to shock our collective awareness. We are going through a period of mass global turbulence with many crises, with increased militarization, with an epidemic of coups d'etats and backward steps in terms of the rights of women and girls. It's unimaginable 18 months ago that a violent conflict would fight out within Europe itself. The world is dealing with the highest number of conflicts since the Second World War, whilst the number of people who have to leave their homes has reached a record number of 110 million. The deterioration of the context of peace and security is the cause of huge suffering for women and children in the affected countries all across the globe. In Afghanistan, women have been wiped out of public life, they're excluded from education and have been plunged back into a situation of poverty. Reprisals against those who defend women's rights, the reprisals against activists and journalists in Myanmar continue to rise. The invasion of Ukraine has inflicted unimaginable suffering on the people. It has also cost many civilian lives. There are thousands of people who have died, have been injured. Children have been forced to leave their homes. Men have been sexually tortured whilst they are detained, and the bodies of women and girls have been used as a battlefield. I went to Ukraine as soon as the first reports on sexual violence came out, and I returned there last March. I've seen many victims there and listened to their stories of sexual violence perpetrated by Russian soldiers. The details are hugely disturbing. There's been sexual violence used as a form of torture to get confessions, to punish and intimidate men and women in places of detention, notably by electrocuting them and by hitting men in their genital organs and hitting women in the chest. There's also been rapes, forced nudity, and other serious violations. The age of the victims has varied from age 4 to age 84. In Sudan, since the start of the armed conflict on the 15th of April between the Sudanese Armed Forces and the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, the sexual violence against women and girls and who are on the move and refugees has been on the rise. 2 weeks ago, I went to Awil in South Sudan, on the border with Sudan. Women who were running away from the conflict told me about their stories of violence. I met a young girl who was age 7 who crossed the border with her grandma and was raped in the refugee camp. The UN documented 95 cases of sexual violence linked to conflict, 75 against women, a man, and 19 children and young girls. In recent years in the war in north of Ethiopia, sexual violence has been used as a weapon in war. According to the International Commission, the conflict would have caused more than 10,000 victims of sexual violence. Sexual violence is one of the most devastating forms of violence committed mainly against women and girls, but also against men and boys. It negatively affects physical health, sexual health, reproductive health, and the mental health of the victims. It's a serious problem which has negative effects on victims, their families, and their communities. It destroys families, breaks up communities, and stops some societies from being able to have sustainable long-term peace. The consequences will have impacts on different generations, notably in terms of the children which are born from rape. Sexual violence in conflicts is an atrocity which highlights some of the darkest horrors of war. As a war crime and as a crime against humanity that has been recognized as under the Rome status, which established the International Criminal Court, that the Security Council looked at this topic in 2009 and has implemented this very specific mandate following the adoption of Resolution 1888. This resolution establishes that sexual violence used as a war tactic during conflicts represents a threat to peace and international security. The members of the Council condemned the brutality and the efficiency of these crimes. They reaffirmed the necessity to to end impunity for such crimes. Since then, significant progress has been made in terms of the global recognition of sexual violence in conflicts, with the adoption of 5 resolutions by the Security Council to fight against this pest. These resolutions have brought about radical change in how the international community sees and answers sexual violence during conflicts. It is no longer considered as an inevitable product of war or as simple collateral damage, but instead as a serious crime which is avoidable and which should be punished under international law. The last resolution, Resolution 2467, which was adopted in 2019, marked a new crossroads by recognizing for the first time the need to adopt an approach focused on the survivors that respects their rights, their needs, and their desires. Under this approach, every measure should be decided with the full and significant participation of the survivors, notably in terms of their medical needs, in terms of their sexual and reproductive health needs, in terms of the psychosocial support to be provided, economic support to be provided, also legal advice and access to justice and reparations. This change of perspective has allowed us to evolve a large group of peace and security stakeholders to bring in targeted sanctions and to make training compulsory, as well as the launch of peacekeepers to support as well ceasefire support, ceasefire negotiations, and to establish commissions, as well as to send these situations to the International Criminal Court. These crimes are now part of international investigations, and the UN system comes to the support of thousands of survivors who used to be invisible and inaccessible in the past. Despite the progress, the use of sexual violence in conflicts remains a painful reality and is still a key part of our daily life. Sexual violence continues to be used as a war weapon, as a terrorism weapon, and a political repression. And even if states have the legal responsibility to end the impunity for these crimes and to bring these people to justice, it still continues, and very few stakeholders and very few criminals are actually brought to court. So impunity remains the norm. The report by the Secretary General drew up a difficult situation in terms of the 20 countries covered by the report. There were 2,455 cases of sexual violence linked to conflicts that were confirmed by the UN. Women and girls represented 94% of the cases.
Et troisièmement, s'attaquer aux causes profondes de ces violences, notamment l'inégalité.
We need to deal with
la pauvreté.
My 3 strategic priorities for the mandate. First of all, prevention, transforming cultures of impunity. Secondly, promoting leadership. And thirdly, attacking the deep causes of this violence. The survivors give me the strength to continue to fight. They are my moral compass. Under my mandate, I focus on grassroots missions. Last June, I carried out an urgent mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, following worrying information which highlighted significant increase in the number of sexual violence cases in the east of the country due to the return of hostilities involving the M23 armed group. I was horrified by the stories of women and girls, many of whom had recently been raped and were still being treated. Many of them highlighted the daily risk of sexual violence when they lead activities to feed people, to feed others around the camps, collecting food, collecting wood, and gathering water. Imagine this situation. They had an acceptable choice between economic survival and sexual violence, between collecting food and being able to survive. Another worrying reality in terms of this situation is the proliferation of brothels inside or around camps for displaced persons. I was shocked by the scale of the sexual exploitation, including forced prostitution, as a method for survival. It is sexual violence motivated by economic despair, where women and girls are forced to become prostitutes for less than $1 in order to be able to survive another day. These survivals and these stories represents different forms of resistance and resilience faced with conflict, and this calls upon us to take action and to strengthen our efforts to prevent these crimes, to ensure that the criminals are brought to justice, and to provide support to the survivors. The survivors need more than our solidarity alone. They need concrete support in terms of justice, reparations, and economic reintegration, as well as significant investment in structural prevention. Prevention against sexual violence, even in the middle of wars, is not simply an aspiration, it's a legal obligation. The priority to narrow the gap in terms of resolution and reality between our aspirations and our field operations, that is the priority now. We must urgently take action with long-term determination to save future generations from this pest. Every person who adds their voice to this cause contributes to bring an end to centuries of denial and silence, which has made rape the secret ultimate weapon of war. Our objective is to make these crimes public and to provide a story to rape, and to ensure that it has no future. United Action shows that the lives of survivors matters, and shows to criminals, current and potential future criminals, that we are watching them. It is time to move on to best practices. The current context of emerging and long-term conflict shows clearly that no protection can replace peace itself. It is essential to respect international norms, to strongly denounce any crimes, and to try to remove the risk of intimidation and reprisals against those who are working on the front lines. We are now convinced that prevention is the best form of protection. I will continue in my role to encourage the international community to pay attention to this cause, to invest in this cause, and to take action to replace horror with healing and hope. Thank you very much for listening.
Merci, Pramila.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci Pramila Patten pour vos mots et notre...
Thank you, Pramila, for your words and your desire to end silence about this terrible weapon of war.
Dr Mukwege, il y a quelques années, souvenez-vous, prix Nobel de la paix.
Dr Mukwege, Nobel Peace Prize winner, also talked about this topic and at a previous edition of the Normandy Forum for Peace. Let's continue. Resistance is about men and women who stand up, who refuse what is often deemed to just be inevitable. There is often a price to pay, and this price is very high. They come from Hong Kong, Iran, Ukraine, and Palestine. So let's welcome up to the stage these figures of peace. He's just turned 30, and he's been resisting for 20 years. Let's welcome Nathan Law to the stage.
Elle,
Next.
elle, pour sa part, c'est en Allemagne qu'elle a...
She is now living in Germany. She had to leave Iran. She is a key fighter against the death penalty. Let's welcome to the stage Cholet Pakavan.
Elle est ukrainienne.
Ukrainian resistant. She wrote her thesis on Russian domination. Let's welcome to the stage, please, Oksana Melnichuk.
Je ne haïrai point. Je ne haïrai point.
I will not hate.
Sur les chemins de...
A doctor in Gaza on the path to peace. This book has also led to the creation of a documentary, I Shall Not Hate, which will be which will be shown this morning. He's from Palestine. He's a doctor, and he
pacifique du conflit
takes his call for peace all across the globe. Let's welcome to the stage Dr. Izzaldine Abdouleish.
Bertrand Badi va également.
And Bertrand Badi will also be with us on the stage.
Il a été.
And online we have somebody who used to be a part of the Petrolco company, and he has now been challenging Putin for 2 decades, and he's living in the US. The dissident Mikhail Khodorkovsky.
Merci de prendre place. C'est un petit peu les chaises musicales, à ce que je vois.
Sorry, we've got a bit of a game of musical chairs going on here. Please take your seats. Get settled in. Thank you very much to all of you for accepting our invitation to be here today. Over to you, first of all, Nathan Law. Nathan Law, you were one of the student leaders during the Umbrella movement in Hong Kong. It lasted 79 days. It was back in 2014. You were 20 years old at the time. Could you tell us a little bit about what was the trigger for you? Why did you start to commit to this fight? Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Thank you so much for the introduction and having me. I think most of us who are sitting on this panel, we share the same emotion, which is we feel extremely fortunate to be able to speak here. 3 years ago, when I departed Hong Kong on a plane and I looked back to the fantastic landscape of Hong Kong, I thought that it would be an eternal goodbye. And a few weeks later, my name was on the wanted list of Hong Kong. And for now, I am awarded £100,000 of bounty by the Hong Kong police force for anyone who can apprehend me and extradite me back to Hong Kong. And I'm being charged under sedition, collusion with foreign forces, all these names that are put on me that made me unable to go back to Hong Kong, to the place that I grew up with and to the place I love. A decade ago, I think I'm at a similar age of all the audience sitting downstairs. I didn't know much about politics. I didn't know much about social movement and all these social values. It was until I learned the stories of the Tiananmen massacre taking place in 1989, where there were a massive groups of Chinese students demanding democracy in China, and also the stories of Liu Xiaobo, the only Nobel Peace Prize winner of China, who is also advocating for freedom and democracy. And you realize that these cases and the sacrifice of people that really impacted my life and moved me. And even though they didn't achieve the democratic transition in mainland China, but they have huge political legacy that made more and more generations to be awakened and to be involved in political movement. And that was why I stepped into the arena of that. And then a year later, when I became a student leader, I was the face of the umbrella movement in 2014, where hundreds of thousands of Hong Kong people campaigned and camped in the busiest street financial center of Hong Kong, and we demanded democracy. And afterwards, I became the youngest legislator of Hong Kong at the age of 23. I was imprisoned because of my experience in the umbrella movement, and then I went into a life of exile. But I was actually really fortunate to be able to leave, because whenever we talk about democratic recession, we talk about theories, we talk about examples in other regions. But for people sitting in this panel, this is personal. This is a bitter and painful stories of us. For me, I was lucky that I only spent a couple months of jail and then get out of Hong Kong. But for many of my friends who are still in Hong Kong, they're spending years of jail time because they spoke their mind, because they campaigned for democracy. And for many more who were injured in protest, and for some who even lost their lives, they are unable to speak to all of you just like me. So I had always been having a feeling of guilt and a fortunate possibility for me to continue to speak up for Hong Kong. And I feel grateful about it. And I think the reason why the case of Hong Kong is so important is because the collapse of Hong Kong civil society with decades of foundation, it only took a year. Like, we used to think that Hong Kong was a free place where it was just like in Paris, in Normandy, that we could speak our mind. But the only difference is we couldn't elect our leader. But at the end of the day, if you have unchecked power with impunity and with that massive amount of resources, a free place could collapse in a matter of months or a year. And I think this is a very important lesson to be learned by the world, which is, for me, I think the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. The price of freedom is every one of us to utilize the civil rights that we have and to make sure that the people in power is held accountable and they are not doing anything with impunity. And I want to end this opening remark with a quote I like very much by Václav Havel, who was the first president of Czech Republic. And he said that we never decided to become dissidents. We have been transformed into them without quite knowing how. Sometimes we have ended up in prison without precisely knowing how. We simply went ahead and did certain things that we felt we ought to do and that seemed to us decent to do, nothing more nor less, end quote. And I think that really summarized my life, which I've been through so many unexpected turns, and I ended up here to be talking to you in the name of a dissident and a politician, but I never felt like I was one. It was all because I made all these choices in my life with conscience. And I think every one of us could become that person who really stood up for what they believe and they changed the society or even changed the world.
Ici,
today at the Forum for Peace, there's many young people, and something that's important for us. And you are very young, Nathan Malo, and you're already very mature already. I would like to, if you could answer these two questions we have. On one hand, we think that it's far more painful to be torn, to see the rights that you grew up with to be torn away from you. It's not the same trying to achieve rights or getting these rights taken away from you with your values. These are part of your culture. And would you have a message to provide the young people among us who also lived in a state of law, that it's not something that is everywhere in the world, that happens everywhere in the world, but this is a message of being vigilant and also to be mobilized to really get mobilized as citizens to ensure that this state of law is being respected and we can continue to move towards a certain progress for everyone?
If you hold your breath for 30 seconds, you feel a sense of deprivation. And that's literally what Hong Kong people are feeling right now, because the freedom of speech are being taken away. The political freedoms are being taken away. They can no longer assemble on the street. The journalists I used to talk to, they all left their job because the government bought all the media and they disband all the free media. And all the social workers, nurses, doctors who've helped the protest, many of them have left Hong Kong because they fear of political persecution. And that is the reason why when we approach democracy, there are a lot of people talking about economic reasons, fighting for food, for economic security. But in Hong Kong's case, it's quite different. It's purely political, it's purely ideological, it's purely about values and freedom of speech and the ability to elect our leader. And I think that is the most fundamental element of a civil society and the society that we got used to. The reason I brought up the deprivation is because, yes, we enjoyed those things. We used to live in a society where we could speak, we could criticize, and we could try to hold the government accountable, even though we've never been able to elect them, but at least we have the freedom to criticize. But for now, they're being taken away. And it is much more powerful than we are looking for an empty promise, because we've got that promise and we've enjoyed it, and now they are gone. And that was a really powerful testimony to all of us, where we just felt like, oh, we take a lot of our rights for granted. We take our society for granted. We take our civil rights for granted. But what if your country, or, well, to the world in certain extent, there is growing authoritarianism, and these dictators, they help each other. They give resources to each other. They support each other on narrative level. And it becomes a norm that if your country is becoming that shape, if you're lacking that vigilance, everything could be gone really quickly. And I think that is the biggest lesson that we've learned in Hong Kong. And trust me, you will never want to experience that deprivation, because it was literally like you're breathing low air and you feel like, yeah, we have nothing, we can do nothing.
Merci, Nathan Lowe.
Thank you, Nathan Law.
À vous.
Now, Shirley Bakaran, you are being presented as the Iranian woman who's fighting against the death penalty. You made a documentary that came out last spring in France that's called This Winter in Tehran. It was actually won the prize, the Peace Prize at the Berlinale Film Festival. Can you tell us what happened to you in 2014, to you and your family?
Yeah, at first I must tell you guys, my English is not so good, but I try my best. My daughter, Rehane, was 19 years old, and she was in a rape situation, but she resisted and self-defended by bit with knife at the right shoulder of that man. And immediately call urgence, and police and doctor comes. In that night, she had arrested by police and started in next day to torture her, because that man was not a normal man. He was employee and a member of Sepah Quds and security service. My daughter was 7 years in jail. And in 2014, unfortunately, she had executed. And I want to tell you about resistance, personal resistance. When my daughter was under torture, of course, she gave up and wrote everything the investigator wants to write. But in 2014, government and security service asked her to write a letter and say, I was teenager and I didn't know good the sign, and that man didn't want to rape me, and I make mistake. I, as a mother, beg Rehane, please write this letter, because I want just my daughter rescue and comes to home. But my daughter told me, no, I can't close my eyes and wash a rapist's face. She tortured in 2014, but she find that resistance is the kind of life. And I learned from my daughter. I am a mother who learned from child. I learned we can stay and stand up. And I learned from my daughter, in the worst situation, you can take action. Because my daughter in jail start and make campaign for save her cellmates from death penalty. And it make my future, my lifestyle. And now I call myself, I am a soldier of justice. I was an artist in Iran, but now I call myself just a soldier for justice, and I am not the first and the last mother. In Iran, we have thousands of mothers who are plaintiffs, and they are looking for justice. But all of us need help to do something, to stop execution, to stop injustice courts. And I ask you people, help us. Mothers, plaintiff mothers in Iran, and of course, young people, same him, in Iran. They are fighting and beating and tortured and executed. Thank you.
Cholet Pakravan, quand on vous écoute,
When we listen to you, we say normally you would be crushed when this happens to you. Where do you find your strength to lead this resistance? And we heard your call for help. Where do you find the strength to continue?
As I told you, I learned from my daughter, but every day I have bloody heart. Every day, every night, every time it comes to me. Every execution happened in Iran, everything repeats for me. I don't want another mother be in my situation. Never, ever. So I must fight. And I found this kind of resistance from this desire. I have a dream, same Martin Luther King. I have a dream, Iran without execution. So I must fight for that, and I do that. I try until my last second of life.
Oksana Menilchuk.
Oksana Menilchuk, you are Ukrainian, you're a politologist, you are the director of the Center for Political Analysis and Communication for Ukraine. 24th February 2022, the world discovers the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. Nobody thought that Kiev would survive, but the resistance of the Ukrainian people surprised the entire world. Where does the Ukrainian resistance draw its strength from, its determination? Can you explain it? Yes. Before I answer, I would like to say that I'm extremely moved by what I have heard today. I was very sensible to what Mr. President said, because you spoke about the European project that we need to broadcast around the world. I need to say this exactly for this European project that Ukrainians are dying today. We resist against the dictatorship, against authoritarianism, for exactly to carry the European values. The Ukrainian resistance is measured by the price, the blood price of our resistance. The Ukrainians know perfectly what is expecting us if we do not resist. We tried to scream, to speak about all this since the last 30 years of our independence. We warned, when I was speaking about Ukrainian independence and the Ukrainian resistance, I was called a nationalist. But the entire world needed to see the catastrophe and the disaster of Bucha and Irpin, to understand why Ukrainians are fighting in resistance against Russia. But it's exactly what you have seen in Bucha, that we, the Ukrainians, live since 700 years when Russia dominated Ukraine. The tortures,
les exécutions,
the mass executions. I'm not going to give you the entire list, but the entire history of Ukraine is a history of resistance towards Russia. There is a strong feeling in the Ukrainian resistance. First, say that the Ukrainian resistance is what main link of the global Ukrainian resilience. Where are the origins of your resilience? Our resilience is made of a certain number of factors. First of all, it's a resistance. It's to resist in all cases. The second factor is the adaptation to the context of the situation. We adapt very quickly. We don't wait for state to help us. Everyone knows what needs to be done. And the third important factor is our capacity to renew. As you see, we are being bombed. The next day, everyone comes and helps to take away the rubble and rebuild what had been bombed. We are not going to wait for victory, because sometimes even our partner says, why are you rebuilding? You're spending our money which we've given you. Maybe you should wait. There will be more bombs coming. And we say, no, you don't understand. If we want to live in ruins for waiting for victory, that is the psychological effect. It's just like when in school there is one broken glass. If you fix it immediately, if you don't fix it immediately, then all the other windows will be broken. And the other important factor is the solidarity and mutual help. We are now all a single organism. Even though the resistance is a very individual aspect, no one forces you to be a resistant. It's your personal choice. And this is where, Mr. Professor, there is a social effect in this resistance. It becomes an event when the energy of each individual person comes together with all the energies of all the other people, creates this resistance effect of a nation. I'm very thankful that you spent about the sociology of the world, because I'm starting to hate the geopolitics, because in geopolitics there is no notion of values, while in the resistance it's not the geopolitical interests that dominate, it's the values. Because if you reason only based on geopolitical interests, it's always the geopolitical interest that prime. If you always reason for interest, then your main interest will be to save your life. But if you reason based on values, and the values for Ukrainians is freedom, that's our religion. We are not Catholics or Orthodox or Christians or whatever. Our religion is freedom. And it's this value that reinforces us, that makes us resilient. And this is where you meet up with Nathan Law at the Price of Freedom. Yes, exactly.
Alors avec nous,
So together in connection from London, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. To start with, Mr. Khodorkovsky, what do you think of what Oksana Melchinuk has said?
Я приветствую вас.
Hello, everyone.
Участие в
I am very thankful to you for this opportunity to participate in this forum. And of course, I support
украинское общество.
The way the Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian people resist to Putin's invasion. And I hope that the Ukrainian society will find the strength in itself to distinguish between Putin and his gang and the people in Russia who, just like them, fight against this regime. Maybe not with weapons in the hands, but by living in very difficult conditions. My personal resistance to Putin started 20 years ago, on 19th of February 2003, when I sent a report to the Kremlin on the corruption at the highest levels of government and of the Russian government. And a couple of months later, there was my first arrest and my first trial. And in October, I was sent to jail. I stayed 10 years in jail. In jail, I would write articles for the press, and it was the only way for me to have any activity. And I did 4 hunger strikes in order to support my colleagues in support of the demands. These 4 hunger strikes, it was to get an answer to our requests. Each article, for me, after each article, I was sent back into isolation. I know all this, so the strategy of the resistance to the Russian regime would have to change, adapted over time. And up until 2014, until the Maidan movement in Ukraine and the annexion of the Crimea, it seemed that the power in Russia could eventually change thanks to votes, thanks to elections. But starting 2014, we understood that this is not possible, and that the victory of in any elections, we'd have to defend it in the street. Starting in 2021, with the change in constitution, it became clear that the elections, fair elections or even unfair elections, do not exist anymore. The change in power is only possible through a revolution and by destroying the laws that have been set up by the actual regime. The events in Belarus have demonstrated that that the danger for the opposition, for the fighting against totalitarian regimes, is a limitation. It's when you limit yourself, when you decide that you're going to limit yourself to a non-violent strategy against violent police repression. The Russian Anti-War Committee and the Russian Action Committee, they said we need to create a wide coalition of the democratic forces in order to fight against the Putin regime. We help the refugees, we help the political activists, we do counter-propaganda measures, And we support resistance groups in the on the Russian territory. We are against, of course, against terrorism measures, but we recognize the existence of a risk of different forms of pressure that has been exerted on our supporters, and the support today. We all remember Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Karambosa, Anya Yashi, Andrei Kebabarov, and so many others. We hope that the victims and that the sacrifice of these people will allow to everyone, even our Ukrainian neighbors, to remember that the Putin regime and the Russian people is two different things. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Mikhail.
Thank you, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Just to remind you the price to be paid of your dissident life, now that you are a refugee in London and you continue the struggle from the outside, I just want to remind you, for you, everything had started well. You were at the head of a big oil company. You were part of Lukas, and you were one of the richest men in Russia. Today, you also use your money at the service of this. And François Xavier has a question. I have two questions for you. The first question, I would be interested, everyone, to have your analysis, Mr. Khodorkovsky, on why was Prigozhin, why did he turn around when he was marching towards Moscow? I've seen one of your declarations said recently that if Vladimir Putin had in front of him people like Reagan, Thatcher, or de Gaulle, he would be scared. What did you mean by that? I am not certain, really certain that I did say that actually, but I know that what I know from Prigozhin, from Yevgeny Prigozhin, and I know a lot about him since 2018, when he assassinated three of our journalists in the Central African Republic, and he announced and he asked $1 million. He put a price on my head, $1 million price on my head. Prigozhin is a war criminal who at one moment decided that Putin is not fighting a sufficiently violent war as it thought it would be. He tried to topple the people responsible in the Ministry of Defense. He wanted to have them replaced. Immediately, very actively, I had supported his rebellion because I think that anything that can weaken the Putin regime needs to be supported. We understand that Prigozhin and people like him, they will never bring democracy to Russia. So there is no reason to exchange Putin against people that are like him. So, but if these people weaken the Putin regime, if their actions weaken the Putin regime, then it's good. And the democratic forces need to grab that opportunity. The fact that Prigozhin stopped on his march to Moscow was linked to the army forces, the Russian army forces, that were not ready to support him, and in this all the way to this stage. So he got scared to not have enough support. The events that the coming events, the next events showed that within the army that in reality, actually, the support for Putin within the army is not a majority, and that there are many generals who were willing to support this rebellion. This has shown us that the Putin regime is not as strong, is not as united as they try to make it believe. And this means that we need to be better prepared during a next similar opportunity that may happen again in order to fight to topple the power in Russia.
Mikhail Khodorkovsky pour ces précieux éclairages. On va changer de région pour ce tour.
Thank you, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, for this very interesting point of view. Now we're going to change, go to the Middle East. Dr. Abu Elaish, you're a Palestinian, you're a doctor, and you have been a victim yourself in this endless war with Israel. Can you remind us of the circumstances that has led you to fight for the peace in the world?
Thank you so much. I am a Palestinian refugee who was born, raised in refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. And when we speak about war, my life was a war. I was living on a daily basis just to survive. Until now, we are living just to survive our day. But in spite of all of these challenges, I didn't let it let me down. I have to succeed. I dreamed from my early days as a refugee from nothing to be a medical doctor. I achieved everything I wanted in life. I became the first Palestinian to practice medicine in an Israeli hospital because I believed medicine is a human equalizer, stabilizer, socializer, and harmonizer. And the happiest moment in my life is when I handled the baby to his mother. The cry of the newborn baby is the cry of life. But life is full of surprises. I have a mission in life to spread peace through health. Then I was hit with the disasters and the crimes of war. 16th of January 2009, when the Israeli tank to shell my house, killing 3 of my daughters and 1 niece. For nothing they did. And there was no reason to be killed, and in times of war and conflict, and that's the message we want. Mostly women and the children, the innocent women and the children, they pay the major price. And my daughters, they have names. They have hopes, they have plans. So for me, Bisan, who was 20, Mayar, who was 15, Aya, who was 14, and my niece Noor, who was 17, they have names, and they represent the voiceless and the nameless innocent people who are dying in silence, and no one to advocate for them. And my answer to that tragedy, through my book, I Shall Not Hate, because I will never be broken, not to give up, but the opposite, to keep moving forward. It's not with hate, because hatred, even now, where I am doing most of my work about hatred as a contagious, destructive disease. It's a contagious disease, and that's what leads to discordant world in our world. And through keeping my daughters alive, through good deeds I established in their memory, Daughters for Life Foundation for education of girls and young women from the Middle East, because I believe this world can't be a peaceful, a free, just, and equal world without women's education, women's role, and to give them the leadership to make decisions in our world. And that's the key to achieve the peace, justice, freedom, and equality with the participation and the role of women. Thank you. Thank you.
When we listen to all of you and we discover the testimonies of your life, of the suffering and the price that you paid, we are moved, we are completely shattered. And this is the recurring question: where do you find the strength to continue your struggle and to believe in it? And you, Dr. Abuleish, we talk about a conflict that seems endless to us, on which we seem to not find any solution. You continue to believe in this peace in the world. I know that when we prepared this conference, you told me about an image as a doctor where you compare the world to a patient. Can you explain that to us? That is really a source of hope.
As a medical doctor, I see the problems of our world as a disease. And the disease, it has its root causes. And it has signs and symptoms, and we need to investigate to have the accurate diagnosis. Once we have the accurate diagnosis, we can set up the right treatment. As Jesus said, seek the truth, and the truth sets you free. And that's what is important. We have to acknowledge that we live in a discordant world. And this discordant world, because we need to walk the talks that we are discussing. And when the patient doesn't need words, the patient who comes to me, not to talk to the patient by the end of the day, he needs a prescription to be cured and to be healed. So it's time for all of us, and it's important for all of us. We live in a world where we all are potential victims. You see it with the COVID pandemic. We all were potential victims and we were exposed. So it's our responsibility, all of us, to take actions, to come together and to speak louder. My freedom is linked to your freedom. My health is linked to your health. And to make it closer, to zoom in, imagine for a second someone who is suffering in this world, who is raped, who is accused, who is doing bad things to others. We need to prevent, and I agree with you, diseases are to be prevented, not to be managed, and war is not to be documented or to be watched by the screen. Wars are to be prevented.
On approche de la fin de
We've not got much time left in this morning's session. So could you give us a bit of a conclusion, Bertrand Badi, in what everybody has said? I've heard that you're saying that we need to help one another, that you need support in your resistant movements. Your resistance movements are rooted in suffering. They're personal and individual experiences need to become more collective because they're universal messages, universal values. So something comes to mind. Nathan Law, you said that the absence of liberty is like trying to live without oxygen. Without oxygen, we will soon begin to start to die. So in debates at the moment, there are risks. How are things going with the resistance in Ukraine? Well, I wanted to talk about the European project. The strength of the European project is that there are very few similar projects that has a vision for the future, that offers a happy vision for the future. Democracy is never something that we can say has been won. It's something rare and precious, and we need to continue to defend it. We always say that lecture theatres need to be defended by tanks. So when you talk about war in Ukraine, it's not just a war in Ukraine, it's a war in Europe to defend European values. And if you talk about it in other ways, if you consider this war as a war for European values and for the European project itself, then the resistance movement will not tire out, no, because what does Putin offer? He offers a different project, a different vision, where he completely wipes out our desire to live as we would like to live. So it's up to us now to defend our desire and our common collective project. Thank you very much, Oksana.
Bertrand Badi.
So then, Bertrand Badi.
Le mot de la fin.
A concluding word, please. Well, let me have 2-3 words in the plural. I wanted to say thank you to all of our speakers, because these 2 panel sessions have been very rich and interesting. And for me personally, I've heard lots of answers to the questions which I had in mind. I tried to think to myself, what is this mysterious social energy that is shaking up conventional international relations? And I've heard some answers now. I've got some answers to the questions. And during these 2 panels, I've seen that the root of this social energy is, as you say, an individual choice. It has been individuals that are now coming to the fore of international relations. So behind this individual choice, there are some very strong, powerful words, such as survival. That was almost your common denominator. When you have to just think about survival, everything else just becomes secondary. And that is how international relations is changing now. The question of survival is becoming at the heart of the international debate, and they don't know how to deal with this. The other important word we heard, and it's linked to survival, and that is recognition. What I have heard from all of you here is that you need the right to be recognized and say, we are just the same as everybody else. We are not babies, we're not children, we're not half portions. We are fully fledged human beings. So being a fully fledged human being, that's an important notion. And what else you said, and what else was interesting, is the cost. You mentioned the cost of non-resistance. You always have to work it out and say to yourself, if I do not commit to this fight, it'll be even worse. So the doctor, you were talking about the diagnosis, and that medical comparison was interesting. So what does this mean? Well, this means that the time for strategies is over. The time for organizing strategies is over. We're in a world of human beings now. There are 8 billion potential stakeholders. 8 billion of us. Remind you, young people, of this. There's not just 193 leaders who decide. There are 8 billion people who decide. And that is something that we have not been able to understand. But that is the new reality of international relations. The new reality of international relations is based on micro-sociology, how these 8 billion stakeholders combine their choices for resistance and their choices to survive. So it's a new chapter in international relations, and we need to start over again. And I was talking about Abbé Saint-Pierre just now, and he was the first person to understand this. Maybe because he was somebody from Normandy, but he was the pioneer in a way, I would say. Thank you, Bertrand. So, a quick reminder that if you want to find out more, to hear more from our speakers, there are books. Nathan Law in 2021, you publish Freedom, How We Lose It, and How We Fight Back. Dr. Abalish, I Will Not Hate. A doctor from Gaza on the road to peace, and there's also the documentary, and it will be projected this morning. It's been projected this morning. And Mikhail Khodorkovsky, your book has just come out, How to Slay a Dragon, Building a New Future After Putin. And with the Collège de Berlin, there was a seminar yesterday amongst Russian opposition to try and bring people together. And
cet hiver à Téhéran. Merci.
Shirley Pakravan, you've also brought out a documentary this summer in Tehran. It's called 7 Winters. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Ça marche pas. Faut pas
Oui,
le-
bah non, on peut pas. Ah, c'était...